what happened on Capitol Hill when it comes to Ukraine security assistance, and then maybe we'll start there, and then we can talk about the prospects for passage.
Well, just as at the outset, Ukraine's security assistance right now is in limbo on Capitol Hill. And that is a result of both political divisions that were ongoing before we had this crisis in the House, of the Speaker having been ousted and there being a leadership fight. But that has certainly exacerbated the situation around what will happen and the avenues, frankly, for actually being able to pass a package that will keep the security assistance and the drawdown packages flowing to Ukraine. This has been kind of looming for a couple of months. There has been an active campaign from the right wing of the GOP to say, look, we shouldn't be spending money on Ukraine. We should be spending money on the U.S.-Mexico border. We should be spending money on our own domestic security problems. And slowly but surely over the last several months, they've managed to kind of build up a critical mass for that among House Republicans. You saw earlier in the summer that the Republicans who were angry about just general budgeting and federal spending issues managed to kind of influence then Speaker McCarthy to say he didn't want to bring a supplemental spending package to the floor. That was actually before Biden even made his request for an additional $24 billion in aid. You saw those numbers creep up as they were arguing about the defense authorization bill, where there were efforts to strike Ukraine aid from that, the authorizations for Ukraine aid from that package. They didn't succeed, but they showed that, a couple more dozen Republicans were actually siding with the naysayers and saying, we don't want to do this. And then lawmakers went home for August recess, and you saw that trend accelerate dramatically in the last couple of weeks, such that there was a standalone vote last week on whether to keep the USAI, the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, $300 million pot going. It's been going for almost a decade, right? But the vote was upside down among House Republicans. Majority of the House still says we should keep this going. Majority of House Republicans say no. And look, we got to the end of the fiscal year without making a decision about whether that Ukraine aid would continue. It was not part of the deal to keep the government open. There is a contingent of people in the Senate, predominantly bipartisan, that say, okay, look, this is so politically charged that we need to go big, we need to go longer. Let's talk about numbers that look like maybe $60, $70 billion that can get us through the next election so this can stop being such a politically fraught issue. But as much as there is, that goodwill among a majority of members of Congress, there is this roadblock in the House, which is now exacerbated because you have candidates for the speakership who are openly opposed to funding the war in Ukraine. Jim Jordan has taken that position for a long time and maintains it to this day. Steve Scalise on the other side of issues. But whoever comes to the helm of the Republican Party in the House and becomes the House Speaker is going to have a lot of control over what happens on the floor. And already now we can't seem to have a discussion about Ukraine assistance absent tethering it to these border issues that have been the top priority. So it's a very fraught time, and it's not exactly clear what the road ahead is, although there's a lot of people making a lot of different proposals, everything from zero it out to try to go big so that we don't have to argue about this again in the next couple months.
Now, I think the thought, at least in the White House and the administration, of many supporters on Capitol Hill, that essentially the Ukraine supplemental and funding the government were going to be sort of tied together. But that seemed to, that connection seemed to be broken over the weekend.
Yeah, I mean, there was that thought because to date, since the Russian invasion, that has been how it has worked. Either Congress has managed to pass a supplemental or roll that supplemental in with other issues, oftentimes with, disaster relief and other sorts of domestic issues, but it's worked to date since early 2022 when this all started. This is a break. And everybody's trying to take a position of, okay, don't panic. There's enough in the pipeline, there's enough in the stockpiles where it's not like Ukraine is going to go belly up or have a major cataclysmic problem on the battlefield if we can't do this in the next, in the term of this continuing resolution, which was a 45-day resolution. I think we're under 40 days to go at this point before that expires. But you can't push that timeline out that long, especially since the power of these packages has been really towards the drawdown authority. Yep. It's been funding that has been mostly to replenish U.S. stocks that are sent out to Ukraine, but that has been the pattern of how this has gone. That has been why there's an argument in both parties of, look, this is not just good for national security, this is good for the U.S. economy as well. However, it is, they need to come up with some sort of solution, be it short-term or long-term. And right now, I mean, this is not the topic of our conversation. Clearly, we're talking about Ukraine, but there is this, it seems like those roads are going to go through an even more intractable problem on Capitol Hill, which is that Republicans are saying no Ukraine funding unless you give us serious changes on the border, which is not just, more funding for border security, but a change in the asylum laws. I mean, that weights down the Ukraine issue with one of the most intractable other policy fights on Capitol Hill. So finding the way through is that much harder.
So it strikes me as two issues. I mean, we'll break down the kind of the distinctions between drawdown authority and security assistance in a moment. But it seems like part of what you're saying is that the challenge is that a Republican Speaker of the House would have to bring to the floor for a vote something that not only divides its caucus, but now looks like perhaps a majority of the Republicans don't support, or would be close to perhaps getting a majority of the Republicans, but would divide his party, but not the opposition. And that's something that any speaker, he or she, would be loath to do.
Republicans have this thing called the Hastert rule, which is basically the assumption that a majority of the majority has to back something for you to bring it to the floor. Now, that is one of the complaints that, it's as enforceable as the speaker actually wants to enforce it. I mean, the speaker can bring up a bill on the floor, but then he potentially faces the ire of the rank and file, which is what we saw happen with Kevin McCarthy. So absent a rule change about who can try to depose a speaker, you might see the same thing play out. Look, Ukraine was one of the issues that Matt Gaetz was railing about when he was on the floor, accusing Kevin McCarthy of making secret side deals with the administration to keep money going that he didn't want to see going out the door. So there's both the question of, can you get around your conference, and I would add that, that a lot of the Republicans who have recently joined the we will vote against this group say that they're still for funding Ukraine. They just want to hear answers from the Biden administration about specific accountability questions. It's not clear the Biden administration can actually provide those answers, so not clear there's a way out of the impasse. But it does seem like it's not that there's 117 diehards against Ukraine funding, right? But there's probably a couple dozen, and we saw that just 8 Republicans were able to, decapitate the leader of the House basically in the last couple days. And unless they change the rules, the next speaker would potentially be putting himself up for the same fate. And that's even if we're talking about a speaker that is inclined to do that sort of thing. I mean, look, Steve Scalise voted to preserve that USAI pot of funding last week with the minority of his party. That suggests that maybe he'd be willing to talk about this sort of deal and to put that on the floor. But I don't think Jim Jordan has actually ever voted in favor of one of these aid packages for Ukraine. Yeah. So you wouldn't even maybe get to that point of the conversation if it was him in the speaker's chair, because he would just naturally be disinclined to rule it out unless somehow forced to.
Now, you mentioned maybe the prospects of a deal of something on the border, something for Ukraine. I mean, how much discussion is there of that on Capitol Hill?
Oh, there's plenty of frantic discussions happening around the margins right now. There are groups of senators who are talking about that. There are people in the Republican Party in both chambers who are openly saying that that's the only way through. The problem is that, look, the House passed this immigration and border security bill, mostly border security bill, a couple months ago. It takes some pretty draconian approaches to how it addresses the Biden administration's parole policies for migrants. It reimposes the remain in Mexico policies of the Trump administration and detentions and wall construction, all this stuff. Although Biden just made a change there, and I know we're not talking about immigration, but the point is, it didn't have any Democratic support.
Right.
The parties don't agree on this, and when you're talking about changing asylum law, that cuts to a lot of people's moral core and makes it really hard to make a deal.
Right, and then if there's been seemingly almost universal Democratic support in the House, and suddenly if Democrats are having to make sort of trade-offs on their domestic priorities, then that calls into question whether they would actually back.
And remember, there's a couple of Democrats who are continuing to support and vote for Ukraine aid, but have voiced concerns about why, whether this can go on in perpetuity, how much the checks are for. Now, that hasn't been reflected in how they've actually cast their vote at the end of the day. But, there are some insecurities at the margins that could be exploited.
There's a theory that I've heard on Capitol Hill that, part of the Kevin McCarthy bringing the continuing resolution up for a vote was the expectation that perhaps Democrats would vote it down and therefore be blamed for shutting down the government because
it's
there
all
was
messaging.
It's all messaging. But that irregardless, that basically that the idea that these two were tied together, funding the government and funding Ukraine, suddenly became separated because frankly, Democrats weren't willing to hold that line. So it raises questions about what trade-offs they would be willing to make.
Well, in the end, it was a squeeze play. We saw that happen over the last weekend, that Kevin McCarthy abruptly changed strategy, said, okay, I'm going to put basically a clean CR plus disaster relief funding on the floor. I'm going to pass it through, and then I'm going to shut down the House. And I'm going to dare you guys in the hours that remain before the government shuts down to cross me. And frankly, the most of the crumbling that happened is, look, Mitch McConnell wanted to keep fighting for keeping the Ukraine package in, and he was kind of outvoted by everybody else in the Senate GOP saying we shouldn't fight that fight. And then it was, Democrats were very hard pressed to say we're going to shut down the government over what at that point for 45 days was about $6 billion for Ukraine, right? That's a hard thing to say. We're going to stake the entire credibility and perpetuity of the government staying open on this one issue. But that was because of basically how McCarthy ended up playing it. It's not a reflection of the fact that the Democratic Party is willing to roll on Ukraine aid in general. And I don't think many Republicans are either. Certainly about 3/4 of the Senate Republicans think that this is incredibly important to do. And almost half of the House Republicans still do too. It's just that who controls the pathway to the floor of the House is a really important question.
So I would like to say I thank you for clearing that up, but it's still, everything is unclear.
Oh, it's completely unclear.
Completely unclear.
It's a very TBD moment.
So in looking ahead, though, to sort of tie this back to the prospects of Ukraine funding, I mean, what is your assessment? Is this is Ukraine funding on life support? Do you think it's unlikely, or are there various avenues that maybe this could happen?
There are various avenues where this could happen. I would say that it's in the most danger that it's been since we've started this era of post-Russian invasion assistance for Ukraine. I think that we will see if there are Democrats who are more willing to make a deal on the border with Republicans. President Biden might have made that a little bit easier in the last 24 hours, frankly, by saying he was going to start construction of the border wall, by talking about deportations of certain groups of migrants. That has angered some Democrats, but it has also opened up the possibility of, okay, we can parlay on this stuff in a way that maybe we couldn't quite as well even last week. So maybe that you're able to actually strike a bargain where the Republicans give a little in order to get the Ukraine aid, and you do end up with a bigger package where that would have to come out of the Senate, and then they'd have to squeeze the House and dare them to vote against it, basically. But if you can't do that, which is definitely not a guarantee that you can, it's going to kind of depend. It's either going to depend on the guts of the next speaker who just chooses to say, I believe in this, so I'm going to put it to a vote because I know it will pass the House, even if it makes my party try to depose me. Or there are various mechanisms that with a little bit of time you can do to try to force the issue. There are parliamentary maneuvers. There are discharge petitions. There are things that we rarely see happen in the House, but that are potential avenues to exploit if people believe in this strongly enough and it gets that critical that's the only way through.
No, well, thank you for that. And normally at a CSIS event, we don't go sort of, we focus on the foreign policy and national security and don't necessarily go deep into the inner workings of the workings of the House. But in this case, it's really critical, not just for the future of U.S. foreign policy for Ukraine. And I think maybe just to clarify, why this matters, and I'll sort of put my panelist hat on for a second, I think there's oftentimes this public sense that the president can just sort of do whatever he wants with the U.S. military. Of course, the president can send forces into war. He's the commander of chief. You would oftentimes need congressional funding support for that, but he can move the forces. But there are all these rules, all these laws and regulations about what the president can actually do and not do when it comes to giving away U.S. equipment. I spent a number of years at the State Department focused on the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs, which is dealing with security cooperation and giving away U.S. Equipment through our security assistance funds. And I think there's a crucial distinction here where there's the security assistance funds. You mentioned the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. All those security assistance funds you have to buy the equipment from companies, which delays things, right? So does a company have something in stock? Well, most of the time, this isn't sort of Walmart. Most defense companies don't have huge warehouses. The U.S. military has the huge warehouses. So then there's this other pot of money that's really critical called Presidential Drawdown Authority. And normally this is capped at $100 million, million with an M. And what Congress did is when they started doing the Ukraine supplementals, they increased that into the billions. And right now it was at $14.5 billion. And that meant the president could go and take $14.5 billion worth of equipment out of U.S. stocks and then just give that straight to Ukraine. And so it's basically, we're talking, ammo and core things that the Ukrainians are basically using on the battlefield. The issue is that as of October 1st, that $14.5 billion has gone down to $100 million. Now, there was stories about the Pentagon having an accounting error, which isn't really an accounting error, but finding basically $5 to $6 billion more in presidential drawdown authority. And what this essentially means is that they looked at, well, if we're giving away sort of rounds that have expired, weeks ago, or years ago, what's the value of that? And they revalued things, they lowered the value, so that gave them more money. So right now, where we are, the current situation is that the U.S. can keep supporting Ukraine the way it's been doing, really for the next 2 to 3 months, maybe through the end of the year, maybe it's sort of an early Christmas for Ukraine. But then you can't pull from U.S. stocks. I mean, $100 million is basically nothing. And the basic support that we've been providing to get Ukraine what it needs to fight this counteroffensive would go away. And there is no magic wand that the president can really wave to just make that go away. Now, there's going to be things that can be done. You can, find some, maybe $1 billion under the couch cushions in the Pentagon and reallocate it. And the congressional committees will likely be supportive of doing that because you need support of Congress. But then that goes to pots of money that then has to be, you have to acquire the equipment, which then creates delays and uncertainty. So it's a brief interlude from me. But Dara, I want to turn to you. You've been obviously tracking the ins and outs of what's happening on the front and in the war. I want to we'll talk about that, but maybe if you could start by how critical is U.S. support for Ukraine? I mean, what would happen if U.S. security assistance dried up or became a lot less reliable?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. And I think it's important to describe what we're talking about here when we're talking about military assistance, because it's the provision of weapons, but it's also the repair of those weapons. We're doing most of it actually remotely right now. We have a hotline, the Ukrainians call it, to get repairs virtually. Some of it's done in person when they move the equipment across the border. There's also planning support. There's intelligence support. It's really essential to where the Ukrainians are at right now for this war effort. It's meant different things at different times. Before the war started, in the 2 or 3 months ahead of time, it was about flowing in small arms, javelins, NLAWs, Stingers to try to blunt these Russian columns coming in. The Ukrainians were also expending a lot of their own artillery at that time. They actually reached a really critical moment pretty early on, and this is from former Defense Minister Reznikov and others. By March, April, they knew that they were getting down to the critical bottom of the barrel of their own organic
March, April
supplies.
of 2022.
22, yeah. So 3 months in. So then you started seeing NATO rallying to try to find all this old Soviet-era equipment that would be compatible. That was burned through pretty quickly. Then we got them onto 155 rounds in the summer, which kept them going.
It's on NATO Western.
That's a NATO
equipment, yeah.
Western, yes. So this is when you started seeing that coming in, you started seeing the HIMARS coming in, the M777s. This allowed Ukraine in the summer of last year to press forward and put a lot of pressure on the Russians in Kharkiv, pushed them out. Allowed them to put a lot of pressure on them in Kherson, pushed them out of part of it. That support has expanded over time into air defense systems, which are absolutely critical. When the Soviet-era interceptors run out, and they will run out, then we are looking at Ukraine running on NASAMS, IRIS-Ts, Patriots. Those are all provided by us and Europe. Now we're in a stage now where we are running low on the artillery rounds that we can give to the Ukrainians. So that's why we're seeing the DPICMs, or the cluster munitions that we've given to them in the last few months. That's essentially to keep them firing until our production fully ramps up.
And those are old U.S. munitions.
Old U.S. cluster munitions. And there was a lot of discussion about that here in town. I think there was a lot of reticence to use that kind of weapon or give it to them. But that decision was made to keep them going. And so if this assistance, if the financial spigot turns off, it's not an immediate translation to things going and turning off in terms of what we give to the Ukrainians. But what will happen is this. Rationing will start happening. So the Ukrainians are in the midst of 3 months into a counteroffensive right now. They're using a lot of artillery rounds. I think it's 6,000, 7,000 a day that they're using in this mode. if they start rationing because they fear that that weapon supply will be cut off, they won't be able to fire that many rounds. It will bring the counteroffensive to a halt, and it will basically put them into a position where they have to hold. Because what they can't do, if they're afraid that our aid stops, is overextend themselves and then leave themselves vulnerable to a Russian reattack. So, if it's a delay of 2 or 3 months and then everything comes back online, a political deal is reached, you still create a 2 to 3 month bubble in that aid. Because as you pointed out, putting in orders and requests from the defense industry, it's not instantaneous. We can give them things, but then the Army has to wait until it's backfilled. These delays weaken us too, because we've given a lot of materials to the Ukrainians. So when we have these kind of budgeting and funding delays, we don't backfill what we need. So it's really important that this stays steady and reliable for multiple reasons on the battlefield and for us in our own readiness.
Yeah, a portion of the Ukraine supplemental is actually just to go to the U.S. military to buy replacement equipment for what it's given away. And so in some ways, by not passing that supplemental, you're leaving the U.S. military a bit short.
Yes.
But I want to maybe sort of press a little bit on the planning. So right now, Ukraine is engaged in a counteroffensive. So what you're saying is sort of the uncertainty right now of U.S. assistance has direct battlefield implications in terms of what their decision making is, right, on whether to press forward. And I mean, but this is also something that Ukraine has had to deal with in the past. But so, I mean, how much do you think this is really weighing on Ukrainian military officers in the field right now?
Well, I think it depends on how long this gap period lasts. I mean, if this is something that can be resolved by the end of the year and there's no real break in terms of what we can provide to them, then they can make plans and arrangements. But if they get the sense by early winter or the spring that there's going to be a significant scaling back of support to them, I think they're going to start to make those decisions. Like maybe we can't press forward as much as we want to. We have to be, we have to ration. We have to go into a scarcity mindset. And
there's been a lot of reporting about the state of the Russian defense industry ramping up its production, finding workarounds around many U.S. and Western sanctions. If Ukraine is now then suddenly struggles for equipment, what is the state of the Russian forces, and what could this mean for the future of the war?
Right. So, Russia has been, over the last year, I would say, since they announced their mobilization in September of last year, they've been tightening up a lot of legislation and increasing penalties for not complying with defense orders. And gradually, they're not there fully, but gradually moving towards a wartime economy, at least in the defense industrial base. So the estimates are all over the map in terms of what the Russians can produce annually if we're just looking at artillery production. Some say 1 million a year, but they're trying to get up to 2 million. And I think it's important to put that into context of what we can do. I think right now we're at 24,000 a month, 28,000 a month. If you look at what the Ukrainians are firing, if they're really firing 6,000 rounds a day, that's less. What we produce in 1 month is less than they fire off in 1 week, and we don't give 100% of those 24,000 to them directly, right? We keep some for ourselves. The Russians are firing off an incredible amount of shells. I mean, they're outfiring the Ukrainians by several factors. They're not replacing at the same rate that they're firing, but if they can produce upwards of 2 million a year, that's basically what we hope to produce plus what the EU hopes to produce together. And we still, if they reach 2 million, we won't be there. I think it's a little over 1 million if you combine like Rheinstahl and what we're trying to talk about.
And of course, Putin and North Korea, there was likely some deals there to get some of the North Korean shells. But this is also part of the reason why the administration provided DPICM cluster munitions to sort of balance out that artillery advantage. Right. But it strikes me that if you run out of the funding to take from U.S. stocks, then suddenly the DPICM, which you've used to kind of help fill this gap, you're not going to be able to provide.
Yeah, the North Korean angle I think is really, really important to watch. The defense minister of Russia going over there and being part of their military parades and being very deferential and looking miserable, I might add, while he was doing didn't want to be there, I guess, and thought he was better than this, which is an interesting facial response of his. But anyway, and then President Putin had the meeting with Kim Jong-un, and the big armored train came to eastern Russia. So something serious happened in between those conversations. If there was an agreement inked about North Korean artillery moving forward to the front line, I don't know, when that would start. It's about a 2-week train ride through Russia, and then, it could be in Ukraine. They have, Ukraine has advantages to deal with that. They have support that they're receiving. They have their own intelligence capabilities. They have the ability to strike depots. So, they're going to try to interdict that before it can be disseminated to the front line. But I do think that's something that needs watching.
And before I turn it to John, I want to maybe press a little bit on the air defense aspect of this. So Ukrainians are running out of their kind of old Soviet interceptors. They've been relying on Patriot NASAMS, the Western provided systems. It seems that Russia has spent the kind of good part of the year rebuilding its missile stockpiles. And I think there's some expectation, correct me if I'm wrong, that over this winter that we can expect sort of what we saw last winter with Russia really targeting civilian infrastructure, Ukrainian cities, as well as the Ukrainian front line, and that there's going to be a real sort of test of how much the depth of Ukrainian air defense. But Ukraine needs supply of air defense interceptors. So if U.S. aid sort of comes to a trickle, what do you see the prospects there of that kind of that air missile war that we've been seeing?
Sure. So the last few presidential drawdowns have focused on resupplying as much as possible with the Western systems. So your Patriots, your IRIS-Ts, your NASAMS. So that's good news. But what happens when Ukrainian strategic air defense systems that can guard multiple cities that are under its coverage zone, when those are expended, then you basically are left with point defense of cities. So there's a Patriot battery that's somewhere near Kyiv. There may be one floating around somewhere else. It's an undisclosed location. But those really can guard a very specific place. So there's cities that won't be protected at all. There will be critical infrastructure, your power supply, your water treatment, your wastewater treatment, things that the Russians target because they know they can hit it. It doesn't move. It's not defended. It makes life miserable for civilians. What happened last year? They did this. They knocked out power for millions of people. The Ukrainians were able to get most of it back online. A lot of it's still damaged. And the Russians could keep pressing on that pressure point at the same time. And there's 2 different audiences for this. Actually 3. The first one is to have something to show to their own domestic population. And they did this in a pretty cruel way last year. On their media, they'd say, look, everybody's cold, nobody has heat. And they would show it on the media like this is a sign of success because they didn't have anything to show on the ground. So there's that domestic messaging angle where the cruelty is the point. And then there's the global audience, which is, I can keep shooting a couple dozen missiles at Ukraine a month. How are you going to build them? You can't. I can do this forever. That's what they want everyone to believe. And then there's the Ukrainian people themselves, which is, I get the Russian theory is the more missiles I shoot at you, the more you will want to rise up against your own government. But we have not seen that. It's actually having the opposite effect. It's just consolidating support for this Ukrainian national identity.
Yeah, and I think the history of kind of bombardment of cities through air campaigns to try to punitive action against populations tends not to lead the population to buckle. But I think does that raise a potential moral dilemma that the Ukrainians might have if they're having to ration their air defense to protect their army on the front lines or their cities, and we would have to then see them probably make a trade-off that means sacrificing potentially, civilians because they have to protect the army, because if the army goes and Russian air power can come into the war, their Russian Air Force, then that could completely change the dynamic.
It could. Russian tactical aviation is not having a great time still. They are using glide bombs pretty effectively against the Ukrainians at this point, and they are trying to target any type of air defenses that they're bringing forward with Lancets or FPVs or the first-person view. munitions. But no, this is a dilemma that is coming. And if if aid really and truly stops, and Russia is launching at Ukrainian cities, then it gets to a point where they can't defend the airspace.
So, John, let me turn to you. What can Europe do? So let's just assume the taps from the U.S. come to a trickle. Is there a capacity or an ability for the Europeans to do more, to step up? As you hear that rhetoric a lot. Can Europe do more and help fill the gap here for Ukraine?
Yeah, well, that's really a critical question, Max, and thanks for inviting me to participate in the panel. I need to note, though, first that because I'm a U.S. government employee, even though we've got academic freedom at the Army War College, the views I express are going to be mine alone and don't reflect those of the Army, the Pentagon, or the U.S. government. Max, I want to answer your question by starting broadly first, and that's to talk about what Europeans have done to date. I mean, frankly, this is, if I were to put a bumper sticker on this, it's a good news, burden-sharing story, right, of what Europeans have done. In fact, if you look at the total military, humanitarian, financial, social, economic assistance, European assistance to Ukraine is actually not quite double what the U.S. has given. Even if we narrow that down to just the military assistance, European commitments slightly exceed those of the United States to date. Now, those are commitments, I acknowledge that, but the Europeans have done a heck of a lot. I'm a little bit surprised, frankly, that our administration has not tried to frame American efforts in this regard in a broader context to explain to the American public that this is really, as I mentioned, it's a good news story, burden sharing wise. And as I've heard others here in town say, even if we just look at the U.S. defense budget, for less than 4% of the U.S. defense budget, the U.S. and its allies are defeating to some degree, at least the land forces, or at least greatly diminishing their capacity at a very low cost, at least to the West. So can Europe do more? My colleague at National Defense University, Dr. Lisa Aronson, she and I have been working on now for not quite a year, a study examining just this question. What is the Allied role in the assistance effort? And we're doing that because in our own strategy, the Allies are viewed as the center of gravity for all the things that we want to do in the world. And the short answer is that the Europeans have been very clear about this, actually, that they are kind of at the end of what they can provide. In fact, we heard very openly the EU's equivalent of a foreign minister, Joseph Borrell, said about a year ago that the Europeans were beginning to run out of certain categories of equipment. More recently, he said almost the exact same thing about a couple days ago. And then earlier this week, we heard NATO's chairman of the military committee, Dutch Admiral Rob Bauer, say that the bottom of the barrel is now visible. So that doesn't paint a very positive picture of what more Europeans could do. However, there are some caveats to this. The Europeans have made an effort to bring more productive capacity online. Dara mentioned the effort to bring more ammo production capacity online. Europe has devoted 2 billion euros to that effort. 1 billion to reimburse EU members for donations they make to try to replenish their own stockpiles, and then 1 billion to fund new contracts. And it was just announced that 7 European countries, most of them unnamed, 7 European countries have taken advantage of that and are going to be issuing contracts to be paid for by this 1 billion euros to produce what the EU hopes will be 1 million rounds over the course of a year. And that year ending by about spring 2024. So there's more productive capacity to come, but it's taking time. None of this works on a light switch, you might think. The other challenge that our European allies have is that they don't have, most of them don't have, the equivalent of a Defense Production Act, right? Now, we haven't taken full advantage of that in our own country, but just having it on the books, the threat that you might use it can motivate industry to move orders in the queue, right? Move government orders to the top of the priority list.
Maybe you could break that down a little bit. So how a European Defense Production Act that would sort of essentially cajole companies to say, if you don't do something, then the government will take that over and just do it. Is that am I understanding that correctly?
To take it over, I think, is too strong of a phrase, but to direct companies to reprioritize how they're fulfilling various contracts, that is something that I think many of us on this side of the Atlantic would like to see our allies doing a little bit more aggressively. And we've got an example of that, right? We saw, at least not in the military sphere, but in energy security, the way in which Germans were able to create or build these offshore temporary LNG terminals when they decided to reduce their dependence on Russian gas. That happened amazingly quickly, and it's only because of flexibility on the part of the German government with regard to regulations and rules that governed that kind of development. We'd like to see the same thing occurring in the defense contracting realm, but as yet, it's not happening. Let me add one more caveat to this. In our research, Dr. Aronson and I have found that there's a civ-mil tension playing out in many of the allies. And that is, when there's civilian authorities ask the military officials, how far down in stockpiles can you dip without, threatening or putting at risk our own national security? The military officers or officials will give their best military advice. But we sense there's a little bit of tension between the civilian authorities who think that perhaps those thresholds are maybe a little bit too high. Maybe the risk assessment is a little bit too conservative, and there might be opportunities to dip a little bit further into those stockpiles.
So let me dig into that a little bit. I mean, it strikes me that one of the challenges here for Europe is that the underinvestment that we've over the last 2 decades mean that when they open their warehouses, they don't see very much. And when you then ask military professionals what they need, to sort of maintain a force that could be, adequate in battle, they have certain standards. Is it, if though we are in a situation where basically Ukraine is fairly desperate for resupply, I mean, does it then make sense for Europe to sort of sacrifice some of its readiness? And what does that mean for NATO? I mean, there's a huge focus on NATO on trying to increase the overall readiness of European forces. And yet there's this tension between increasing their readiness, but also providing aid to Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, we're struggling against a phenomenon that began to play out, about 30 years ago, right? I mean, the post-Cold War era, the primary story, the main story there is a defense drawdown, right? Cashing in on the peace dividend. We saw this play out across Europe. Our own country did it, right? We spend less of a percent of our GDP on defense than we did during the Cold War era for very good reasons. But that defense drawdown, as it played out in Europe, we are now reaping the results of that. Now, to some degree, there was a bottoming out of those trends almost a decade ago in response to Russia's first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. But the response to that rebound that we hope to see has been slower. It's been particularly slower among the big players in Europe. I'm speaking of the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Brits. Together, those 4 countries account for 2/3 of European NATO military spending. So if they're not rebounding to a great degree, it's going to be difficult for NATO, for European NATO, to really create the mass as well as the advanced capabilities we like to see. Now, most of our European allies since 2014 have been, as I mentioned, spending more on defense, but they're mostly investing in greater capability and less in capacity. So the response, the answer to your question of, well, could Europe be doing more to dig into those stockpiles? It really depends upon where you sit in Europe. Right. If you are a frontline state, so to speak, a Baltic state, Poland, Romania, you're going to be a little more reluctant, or Finland now, to dig into those stockpiles. But if you're further west, not close to the proximate threat of Russian ground forces at least, thinking of France or Spain, the UK perhaps, I think there's greater capacity there, potentially, to dig into the stockpiles a bit more.
Yeah, it does strike me that part of the dilemma here is that I think Europe probably could do more. They could put more money on order with their defense industry contracts. The EU, is right now debating whether to have a 50 billion euro fund approved for Ukraine. Much of that's not necessarily about defense industry, but you could take some of that money or increase it and start putting more contracts in. But again, that takes time and then creates this potential gap when industry starts humming, and maybe do a European Defense Production Act, or at least do that on certain national level, but moving to more of a wartime footing. But that still creates, a bit of a bubble, as Dara put it. But Karun, maybe back to you. So, it seemed like over much of this year, there was just like a confidence that Ukraine assistance was just going to, pass, through the Hill. Given what we've just heard, perhaps was this just a hiccup, and then when everyone sort of realizes actually this has real is potential impact on the battlefield, that the Europeans are actually doing a lot and they've given away a lot, and so there isn't sort of a ready solution of just of Europeans doing more, that there's actually a potential real problem here. Do you think that will sort of sharpen the minds on Capitol Hill?
Not to be a downer.
Yes.
But no, I think there are people on Capitol Hill that already know that. I think there are a lot of people on Capitol Hill that are acutely aware of the critical nature that keeping the financial spigot flowing has to actually being able to not just sustain Ukraine's war effort, but make sure that the Europeans don't falter, because the United States has played a galvanizing role. I think there's plenty of people who also realize that Europe is putting plenty of skin in the game, given the comparative size of the economy of the United States versus that of the European continent and the EU or the European NATO members. But that has not been able to break through the political messaging that says this isn't our problem. This is a war that's far away. The Europeans aren't doing enough. I mean, these are messages about Ukraine that started off before this war was happening, right? I mean, there were complaints that happened during the Trump administration time about what is going on with the Europe versus the United States and how much skin there is in the game. Yes, everybody kind of got together on a multinational level when the Russians invaded Ukraine, or when it was imminent that they were going to. But that didn't fundamentally change the politicking and the political messaging that's happened in certain branches of the GOP and across certain areas of Capitol Hill. And in a time of, in a time in which people are still kind of feeling the after effects of the pandemic, and when I say people, I mean like the American population, where the various investment achievements that the Biden administration is trying to trumpet are not necessarily being felt at people's kitchen tables. It's a powerful message to say, why are we sending this money abroad when we should be keeping it back here at home, as inaccurate as that message is, right? And so you've seen the polling on Ukraine shift. You've seen that even though people still say, yes, of course, we think Putin's a bad guy and we don't want the Russians to win this, there's this reticence when it comes to, should we keep writing the checks for this? And that has fueled that message of the anti-Ukraine aid camp. And it scared a bunch of other Republicans into being afraid of crossing that line, because they're afraid of having, getting payback from their constituents. And every politician, especially in the House where they have to run in every 2 years, is always afraid of a primary challenge. And so this sort of corrupts the logical argument that you could lay out of, here are the facts and here are the numbers and don't you care? People will still say, yeah, but
Right.
how do I convince people who aren't paying attention to that? And frankly, that pendulum is shifting in one clear direction. So the question, that the debate on Capitol Hill for what's the information that could actually clarify people's minds, does seem to be shifting over to this question of, accountability, which is a very squishy word, right? But people on Capitol Hill, the people that are swinging over to the naysayer camp, or at least voting with them right now, even though they say they want a reason to be able to support Ukraine aid, are saying, I just need to know more about exactly where these weapons are going. I just need to see more of a plan for how we can actually, support Ukrainian victory, so that we're not going to be in this, in a Vietnam type situation where this goes on. I mean, it's not exactly the same, obviously, but we're not going to be in a situation where this goes on for years and years and years, and we end up in a stalemate and just walking out at the end having burned through hundreds of billions of dollars, and what did we get for it? And I think that's where there's you can change minds and bring people back. But that's also, difficult to ascribe fault, because the Biden administration can only say so much, because they can only track weapons so far into Ukraine after the, ownership changes hands to be under Ukrainian control. And also because, it's that there have been limited avenues for this message to actually get to those House Republicans. I mean, it's not like Kevin McCarthy was giving cabinet level officials, or even Ukraine's president, a forum to have an audience with the skeptical House Republicans when they asked for one. And so if you don't have that dialogue, it's really hard to answer those questions.
And it also strikes me that the politics of this, though, the public opinion has shifted, but it's still, I think, somewhat surprisingly above water. It's above 50% American support for security assistance. And there's also been a critique of the Biden administration that they haven't sort of done enough to actually articulate the case. They haven't really made the kind of more sharp political attacks maybe against those that are opposing Ukraine aid. I'm curious if you see that evolving, and particularly if there's a situation where Ukrainian cities are being struck and Ukrainians are saying, America cut us off from munitions. That strikes me as also walking a political fine line for some Republicans in the House. Maybe not all, but for some.
I mean, it is. And those Republicans are being very outspoken about this isn't a real fight. This is a politically manufactured crisis that we're having where it shouldn't be this hard to just say this is the right thing to do for all these different reasons. That it's a benefit to the United States domestically, national security wise. It's just the creep of how this could happen if Ukraine isn't defended. There's even they are mounting the counter arguments to the far right argument of we don't want to end up in a situation where we're in a head-on war with Russia, saying this is the way to avoid that, right? And avoid putting American boots on the ground in an evolved situation where NATO gets dragged in more directly. But they're not breaking through. And that's been the problem. Like, it is not that people don't understand this. It's not even that a majority of people don't understand this. There just seems to be, we haven't found either the person or the exact message that can cut through and push back the tide of skepticism. Look, Biden's supposed to be giving a speech about this. We'll see if there's something that he can say, if he takes the gloves off and just gets real, down to brass tacks about this. We'll see if the people that he needs to say that to are actually going to listen to him as well. And again, this is a situation where you still have a really robust majority of the lawmakers in Congress that agree with the president, that agree with the points that you just made about, the facts and the vitality here of this aid. It's just that there's a small crew that seem to have this really important pressure point that they control in the House of Representatives, and that's the problem that they're facing.
Dara, let me turn back to you. So, one of the things that we have seen is that the Ukrainians have actually, they do have a defense industrial capacity of their own. They're starting to produce more missiles and drones that are targeting Russian sites. Not that that will be able to make up for any gap in U.S. support, but if there is a challenge in being resupplied, I mean, does Ukraine have any, what's the state of its defense capacity? I've seen reports of German and French companies starting to maybe open factories within Ukraine itself. Is there promise there, or is that, we're talking about timelines that are well in the future?
Well, I'd say there's good news and bad news, and I'll start with the bad news first. This was part of Russia's strategy when they started this, was the full-scale invasion, was to deliberately target Ukrainian defense industrial sites and try to destroy as much of that organic capacity as possible. And they did damage quite a bit of it. So that's a problem. However, the good news is that owing to the Soviet relationship, there's actually a lot of know-how inside Ukraine with Ukrainians for producing different types of really advanced stuff. After Russia invaded in 2014, there was a big divorce with Antonov, which produced a lot of Russian heavy lift because a lot of it's based in Ukraine. So that relationship was severed. That knowledge remains inside Ukraine. They've been able to do a lot with their own missile capacity. The problem is it's not safe. Russians know where a lot of these sites are, and they try to target them. And now a lot of their missiles are getting shredded by Ukrainian air defenses, but not all of them. I think the idea of a joint venture is a good idea. I'm wondering, though, if there's a temporary solution where those facilities are actually located abroad, near Ukraine, inside NATO, because Russia won't touch them. I don't think so, based on what we've seen of them. That's not guaranteed, but it is a sanctuary that potentially is temporary. You have Ukrainian workers moving abroad, they're making things, it's coming back in, and when things are at a point where it can be potentially relocated inside Ukraine, that's one pathway to do it. The Russians will try to inflict costs on if France or whichever country tries to come and reestablish that inside Ukraine, they'll try to target it. But I do think that there's a lot of IT knowledge. Ukraine is at the forefront, really, of drone warfare. There's so much that they are doing with melding commercial and state capacity together to produce outcomes on the battlefield. There's a lot of talent there.
Yeah.
So that's the good story. It's not rebuilding this from scratch. I mean, we're talking about creative minds, putting things on the ground that work with limited resources. I mean, I think I just read an article recently that they've started doing titanium welding on their own, which is pretty tough for M777s because they need it to be repaired quickly.
Yeah.
So there's the spirit, there's the technical knowledge, there's the historical background. Those are all positive things working for them. The negative, of course, is having a safe place to build these things.
And one of the things with the potential challenge of funding is, well, if the U.S. can't pull from stocks, the hope is that our industry could start humming, and I think there's some hope that we would be able to reallocate funding within the Pentagon and then could buy the equipment off the shelves. What's your sense of our production? So if we're producing more rounds, I mean, presumably those could come off the factory line instead of going back into U.S. military warehouses. We could get ours in 6 months, and we could take those and give them to Ukraine because we would buy them from the company. Is our production, over the last year and a half really ramped up, or are we still kind of waiting for that to really happen?
Well, it has changed quite a lot since the beginning of the war. And that's, to our credit. I think it's not really meeting the needs yet for Ukrainians. There is a plan for it to be ramped up pretty high, I think, in a few years from now, 2 or 3 years from now. But again, that doesn't help right now. To your question, that's a political will question. Is the administration, with support in Congress, willing to do that? Saying, I'm sorry, we're going to pause this batch. Army, you have to wait your turn. We're going to give this to Ukraine because they need it at this moment. That's a political question. It's possible.
Right. I mean, it sort of gets to the issue. There's constantly sort of talk of, Europe versus Asia. Do you focus on China? But if the administration decides that, well, no, we have to just prioritize this fight right now, even if we don't have funding, and we'll move money around. I mean, that would potentially limit what's available for Asia. And so, in some ways, they would. By not passing this funding, you're sort of forcing that hard choice on the administration. And, I'm not sure what they would do. I think they might prioritize Ukraine or try to do both badly. But I think that you would create actually a real tension there.
It's possible the China problem set requires different tools than what we're talking about. For what's happening right now on the ground in Ukraine. Just to kind of paint a picture for everybody. I mean, I spent some time looking at Google Earth and commercial satellite imagery of all the old Russian bases that I used to know about. It's empty. They're empty because all the equipment is in Ukraine right now. So there's this, what we're doing right now is not a waste at all. Like, what we are doing is we are helping a country fighting for its freedom. We are also keeping the Russian army fixed in Ukraine and away from NATO borders. They're just not there. On the border of Finland, on the border of the Baltics, pick your spot. The Russian army they're not there. It's tumbleweeds in these bases.
Right. I mean, that would, John, strike me as perhaps, I get military officers in Europe saying, well, no, we need to have this much in our inventories to be ready. But given what Ukraine is doing and sort of defeating the main adversary that you would be ready for, strikes me as a trade-off probably worth making there.
I think it does, but again, I think it depends upon where you sit. And my comments earlier, what I mentioned, that was really a caveat, right, to the broader theme, which remains true, which is the Europeans are, to quote Admiral Bauer, seeing the bottom of the barrel, at least in the short run, right? There's potential for more over the next couple of years. I'm a little concerned about our efforts to try to maybe increase production or build more productive capacity near Ukraine. We've seen examples, for instance, of purportedly Russian efforts to sabotage a Bulgarian ammo storage site.
Right.
The Poles have uncovered a spy ring that they allege are composed of Russian spies bent on destroying rail lines that take equipment from Poland to Ukraine. So I think the Russians would try, maybe if only on a covert level, to try to undermine any effort in that regard. Again, that pushes us to look more farther to the west, right, Western Europe. So I think there is some capacity there, but it's minor. It's not going to fill the gap It's certainly not going to help over the next 3 or 4 months. We just can't turn it on. They can't turn it on that quickly.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think there was a Czech factory that was blown up after 2014 and led to the expulsion of Russians from the Russian embassy in Prague. Maybe a final question to you. I mean, so if you're sitting in Europe, what does this say about the kind of reliability of the United States if suddenly everyone is really concerned about whether the U.S. is going to simply maintain its support for a country that's fighting one of our main adversaries and having some success? I mean, what do you think that does to kind of our kind of broader reliability of the United States, and how will that be perceived both in Europe and globally?
Well, I think in Europe certainly is perceived very negatively. I mean, in all my interactions there, when I travel there for research or I meet Europeans here in our country, I get the same kind of questions about what's the reliability right now of the U.S. Congress, what's the reliability of the U.S. going forward if there's a change in administrations in 2024, Donald Trump returns. They're all very nervous about that. I think there's some good reason for that kind of skepticism, but I think to some degree they're also maybe missing the big picture. Karun mentioned some of the polling data, some of the political trends don't look very good in the short run, but there's perhaps potential over the next few months if we step back from the heat of the political storm that's playing out here, or the political fire that's playing out here in Washington. But broadly speaking, I think, frankly, it undermines the American role, I should say the perception of the U.S. role. It's not very confidence-inspiring right now.
Yeah, it sort of, in some ways, reflects kind of a degree of fracturing of kind of an American consensus when it comes to foreign policy, and that sort of has broader implications. We've seen that happen in the past, but this, I think we sort of forget that last year there was real bipartisan support for all of these supplemental bills, and that's, I'm curious. Maybe final question to you, Karun, seeing, if you were a member of Congress and a Republican member, and you voted for most of probably these appropriations last year, does that have any impact, or is that sort of that kind of consistency? Because I would think there was bipartisan support last year. Not much has actually changed in terms of the importance of this war.
I think the reason that you're seeing some people break that streak of having supported this is just because it's not the hot new thing that's got the momentum that's going along. Mm-hmm. The counteroffensive has been going for a few months. The line isn't changing as on the ground as dramatically as it was when everybody at the beginning thought that, if you don't do this, Kyiv will fall in a matter of weeks. And that didn't happen, and Ukraine made gains. And there felt like there were very urgent reasons as things were playing out on the ground in ways that now have kind of started to not stalemate, but just slow, basically. Mm-hmm. And members of Congress have a lot of things on their plate, oftentimes have very short attention spans, are on these 2-year cycles, especially in the House, and they want to back a winning horse. And if the horse doesn't seem like it's pulling ahead in a dramatic enough fashion, they start to question, like, well, is sunk cost theory, if I keep going with it, or is it something that I should turn around on, or at least, saber rattle a bit and demand the administration give me more answers before I stay on the team. And I think that's part of what you're seeing play out. Again, most people who were on board remain on board with this and think that it's important. But you're starting to see, several dozen Republicans decide to step off because they want to know that they're doing something that's going to be a winner, both in the geopolitical sense and to their constituents who have to vote them back into office back home.